Hey friends on the internet, this is Community Ecology Part 1 and 2. Now, we went over Part 1 yesterday, so it's going to be a quick review, and then we're going to get into Part 2 of Community Ecology. So in Part 1, we discussed a little bit about biodiversity, topics like species richness, which you might associate with biodiversity. Also, relative abundance. Relative abundance is discussed on page 1216. It's basically how many of each different species there are. Now, in reality, if you want to look at overall biodiversity, you need to know how many different species there are and how many of each one there are, right? So if you had 100 species of something living on your farm, Mason, but you only, like 50 of them, you only had a few, that's not really a lot of biodiversity, right? Because those could very well go extinct or something happen to them very quickly. Walker over here might have 50 different species on his farm, but he might have 50 to 80 of each one. So that would seem like, there's different measures of biodiversity. Which is more important, the different numbers, how many of each one, should they both play a role? Well, we're going to get into that tomorrow when we study and figure out how to do Simpson's Diversity Index. So there's a number of different equations to figure out biodiversity, okay? And this is the one that AP uses for AP Bio, and so that's the one we're going to work through. So I've got a little practice exercise or two for you guys to learn how to use that tool. Remember, on the AP exam, those formulas will be given to you, so you don't have to memorize them, but you do need to know how to apply them. We spent a lot of time yesterday talking about competitive exclusion principle, where that says no two species are going to what?
Share the same territory.
Yeah, they're not going to be in the same niche. Because if they are, one's going to be better than the other. And the other one's going to have to die off or leave or go somewhere else and figure something else out. So you can't have two species occupying the same niche all the time. Where they live, where they, what they eat, where they drink, all that kind of stuff. You have to spread out a little bit. Now, we talked about different types of relationships. Predation, where you have a predator-prey relationship, or competition, where you're competing with someone either of the same species or someone else to get a certain resource. It can be like a lion and a hyena competing for a wildebeest. And then the other types of relationships you need to know are the symbiotic relationships, where you have two organisms that are living in close contact with one another. Parasitism, we talked about. Different types where one is benefiting, the other is harmed. Commensalism, where one benefits, the other is unaffected. And mutualism, like a bird and a flower, where both benefit from the relationship. Okay? We talked about some different adaptations for survival, like mimicry. What's another one? Camouflage. And we will get more into those, I think, when we get to evolution. All right, and then let's go on to Part 2. So Part 2, the first part of Part 2 is called the non-equilibrium model. And, well, hold on, it says stability first. So in an ecosystem, if you have stability, what does that mean? What does that mean is happening in your ecosystem? What? Equilibrium. It's staying pretty much the same, right? There's not a big fluctuation in animals, plants, environment. So the non-equilibrium model, what does that mean, Matthew? Read A for us.
So, periodic disturbances occur altering the environment, species, composition over time.
All right, and what are some of those periodic disturbances that could happen, Tay?
Fire, flood, drought, human actions, storm, hurricane, typhoons.
All right, when you have environmental disturbances, what does that do to the species that are there? Kills them, displaces them, or could cause changes in that species, okay? Now, I know normally when you think of evolution, you think of like a drastic change from one species to another, like dinosaurs into birds or something like that. But really, evolution is just about, it can be at the micro level, can be small changes in their genetics. So it could be, for example, like in Alabama, before the colonizers got here, about a third of the state or half the state was covered in longleaf pine trees. Most of those were cut down. We don't have many longleaf pine trees anymore. And so our forest rangers are trying to reestablish longleaf pines. Unfortunately, one of the adaptations that longleaf pines need, they need stability in their environment. And one of those, I guess I could call it, it's an unstable stability. They need fires periodically in order for their seeds to germinate. Does that make sense? So I know fire is kind of makes the environment, changes it and makes it a little bit unstable. But the reality is, like, plants like that need that periodic fires or instability in order for their seeds to germinate and for them to start to grow. And since people have been around the last couple hundred years, what happens when there's a fire? What do? We put it out. When you put out the fires, then those plants can't germinate and they don't grow and you don't wind up with any. And then that infects the environments that those animals live in. Like, we have a endangered woodpecker called the red cockaded woodpecker that only lives high up in tall, large, longleaf pines. And those are endangered because there's not many tall, large, longleaf pine trees. So that's a disturbance. So not having fires, I guess in that case, would be a disturbance because it's changing the environment that's normally there. Interesting. We used to have buffalo in Alabama too. Do you might know that?
Yeah, I think you mentioned it in class.
So south of here, y'all probably heard of the Black Belt region, which refers to the soil. Historically, that was referred to as the Black Belt Prairie. So prairie indicates it's mostly grasses. And so basically what would happen is you had these buffalo and bigger animals, sometimes elk, that would graze and come through, and then there were periodic fires that cleared the underbrush back, and it basically kept it kind of knocked back to a prairie area south of here, okay? Some of it was geologic, some of it was fires. And, people came in, they killed those animals, nothing to really graze down the small little bushes and shrubs that came up and trees. And so with nothing there to graze them down, people putting out the fires, trees grow up, no more prairie, okay? So we see changes that result because of things that we do. Ecosystem succession. So succession means what? Historically.
Succeeding the previous person.
Yeah, so if you think about this like kings and queens, succession means like who's coming next in line. And the same applies to ecosystems. So in 1223, we've got one of our worst fires in the U.S. history in terms of natural environment. A large portion, I'm going to say about probably 60% of Yellowstone National Park, our first national park and one of the most treasured, burned in 1988. Now, I remember in the, I want to say early 90s, you can see what it looks like here after it burned. In the early 90s, we visited Yellowstone National Park, and it looks something similar to what you see on the right side over there, where the grasses have started to grow back and you have a few trees that are still alive, but most trees and other things have died back. So what led to those massive wildfires, you think? Probably some dry conditions. And what did we say? So naturally, things have caught on fire, different environments, and the undergrowth gets burned back, and then stuff starts to grow, right? Well, if you keep putting out all the fires, then what happens to that undergrowth? And like leaf litter builds up. And then when you do have a fire that you can't control, then it goes crazy. So that's what happens a lot of times out west when we hear about these large wildfires. Like, what the heck's going on out there? Why do they have all these fires? We don't have any fires. Well, one, they don't get as much rain. Two, it's a lot hillier and mountainous. And three, they don't do many controlled burns like we do, probably because a lot of it's very hilly and hard to contain. But when there is a fire outbreak, it's usually really bad. And so burns a lot of stuff. And because it burns so hot, like let's say you're a pine tree, Mason, like a ponderosa pine, and you are fire tolerant. So you can tolerate small fires. But when you have a massive fire like the one in Yellowstone, what happens? You burn like a crispy tater. Crispy tater. Yeah, there we go. You might say French fry. So That's what happens to a lot of those plants. And just imagine what happens to the animals. They die too, okay? Even if you're going underground, you'd have to get really far underground to avoid like that kind of heat. So anyway, let's talk about succession. Primary succession occurs when? In the beginning. Yes, primary does mean first. No. Primary succession occurs where you don't have, you people should know this, soil. So this is a succession that takes place where there is no soil. So the two main instances I could think of would be volcanoes, where you have volcanic activity, hardens into rock, you have no soil. Glaciers. When glaciers melt, all you're left with is what? Rocks. Good. So usually what happens is that water, as it melts out of the glacier, any sediment or dirt gets like washed away. So you're left with just like rocks. I mean, they may be this big, but there's a bunch of rocks there, okay? Excuse me. So what do we call the first species to occupy an area? Pioneer. So they're the first ones to come in. If you only had rocks there, what could come in and grow? What? I don't know about, it would have to be almost underwater for algae to grow or very moist. Yeah, mosses or lichens are the two main ones. And those still require usually quite a bit of moisture. Mosses more so than the lichens. So, and it takes a while for other stuff to start to grow. Like in order to get grasses and shrubs and things like that, what do you need, Matthew? Yeah, and so you're going to have to wait till when? Those rocks break down. So that's going to take a long time. So primary succession is very, very slow. Secondary succession, you still have what in place? As long as it wasn't the silver play button. What? You still have soil in place. What type of disturbance would destroy everything and still leave soil in place? Okay, fire is probably a good one. Okay, we still got soil here, but there's not much else left. Hurricanes, tornado, things like that could come through and destroy some of the landscape. Human activities like clear cutting, good, where you come in and just chop everything down, take everything out, nothing left, okay? So those are all examples of secondary succession. Now, secondary succession occurs much more quickly because you have soil. So if I were to clear off a field out here with a bulldozer beside the school and I left a bunch of dirt out there, what would happen within the year? Stuff would start growing. You start seeing little grasses and flowers and stuff, right? So, and then you have shrubs, and then you have pine trees, and then you have oak trees that come in over time. That established community that doesn't get replaced, like for us, it would be like hardwood forest, oak trees and hickories and stuff like that. What do we call that? The last community that comes in, the main vegetation, it's not going to be replaced by anything else. Nope. It's in your notes. It's in bold. None of you read these. It's a disappointment to life. Yes, climax community. Climax means like the apex, okay? So it's not going to nothing's going to come in and replace those things. All right, the next thing, biodiversity. We talked about this at the beginning of class. Species richness means the number of different species, relative abundance, how many of each one. Like I said, we're going to hold off till the end or tomorrow to work on that calculation, but we'll work through that. Let's see. What are some other things that affect biodiversity? Okay. First one there, large area. Typically, the larger the land that you have, what's going to happen to biodiversity? More. So the more land, the more space, the more stuff there is, right? The equator. As you go away from the equator, north and south, what happens to biodiversity? Less. Now, that's generally true, right? You could almost say another way of putting that in a little more detail would be as you go from the equator toward the poles, biodiversity decreases dramatically, increases some, and then decreases again. Why would it decrease dramatically? Deserts. Remember, deserts are found about 25, 35 degrees north and south of the equator. So you're going to have a dramatic drop off in biodiversity. And then biodiversity increases again because you have more,
Cooler.
it's a little bit cooler and you have more rainfall. What ecosystems
Tropical. No.
above deserts?
I don't know what's called.
Where do we live?
Like tropics.
Forest, good. No, we're going away from the equator.
Temperate.
You go tropics, desert, if you're going north. Then you have temperate forest, right? Then you have coniferous forest. And then you have the polar ice caps and tundra, which are much colder and less biodiverse. So, but in general, yes, as you go away from the equator, it does get less and less biodiversity. I like how you boys are taking no notes. You see these people over here on the left side of the room? They're all taking notes. You two are the only ones that aren't. Get your lives together. All right. See, I didn't call out their names. Yes, I didn't want to chastise them on TV. What else we got? Islands. When you're talking about islands, so there are two main well, I'm going to say there's three main factors that affect island biodiversity. One is what?
How close you are to the mainland?
Yeah, so the closer you are to the mainland, what's that going to do to biodiversity? More. Why is that, Matthew?
Bigger area, more land.
I didn't say it was bigger. I said it was closer to the mainland. Putting words in my mouth. Sarah, if you have an island that's closer to the mainland, you have two islands. Everything else is the same about them. Size, how old they are, geography, blah, 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 latitude, whatever else. The one that's closer to the mainland will more likely have more biodiversity. Why?
More species can come from the mainland to the island.
Yeah, generally you would think the closer it is, the easier it is for stuff to get there, right? Okay, so, and more quickly. What's another main factor that affects island biodiversity?
Size of island.
Size. So the bigger an island is, the more biodiversity you would expect to find. So there's one other factor I think plays a key role here and you would have to control for. What other main thing would determine how biodiverse an island is?
Amount of disturbance.
Well, disturbance plays a role. That's not what I was thinking of, though.
How old the island is.
How old it is. The younger an island is, so if you're talking about volcanic islands that are forming, like, it's not going to have much biodiversity, right? Because it takes a while for stuff to get there. So, like, if you're talking about distance from mainland or how big it is, you would have to control for how old it is. Because that's going to play a big role in how much biodiversity. Like, if you think of Hawaii, the Hawaiian Islands, when they first started out, not much there. Hawaiian Islands now, lots of biodiversity. So it takes a while for stuff to get to islands because they're so far out of the way. Okay? Any questions? I say we've got a few minutes left. Let's work a few math problems. Okay? So y'all are going to see some of these on the test. I should probably give y'all a quiz on this, but I haven't. Just get out a blank sheet of paper that you can work through. And friends at home, y'all can practice these with us. Yay. What do we got here? All right. All right, you got this? So when we're calculating, did y'all hear that? Percent growth rate. I think it's on a chicken meat murray. All right, the percent growth rate or population growth rate per 100,000 individuals. So typically, when you're looking at census data, it gives it in not per 100,000, per thousand, okay? And so let's say we have 19 births per thousand, 8 deaths per thousand, 7 immigrants per thousand, and 5 immigrants per thousand. Okay, so what I want you guys to do is to calculate the percent growth rate, and I also want you to calculate the doubling time, which means how long it will take for this population to double at the current rate of growth. Okay? Good. All right, guys. Coming to you live from Hillcrest. Sarah, what did you get for the percent growth rate? What did you get when you added these together?
13.
Okay. So births are positive, deaths are negative. Immigrants are positive, immigrants are negative. When you add those together, you should get 13. Okay. So we've got a plus 13 for every 1,000 people, right? So it changes, like if that's the year, it changes 13, there's a plus 13 for every 1,000 in that year. Now to get the percent change, you would divide how much it changed for the number of individuals, multiply it times 100, and you get the percent growth rate. Okay? And the percent growth rate is? 1.3%. Now, doubling time, you take that number and what do?
Divided by 7.
You don't divide it by 70, get your life together.
70 divided
70 divided
by
by the percent growth rate. So you take 70 divided by our percent growth rate. What does that equal, Walker? Did you do it the other way?
Yes.
Sure. I'll give you a second. This isn't much. I could probably guess pretty close. But
I don't know, skip me.
no, here I'll do a separate one. If you invest in some stocks, Ashlyn, and let's say actually you put your money in a bank account, which is probably a horrible idea, and you're only getting 1% interest back per year, how long will it take for your money to double?
7 years.
What?
7 years.
7 years?
7 years.
70 years. Good. Some people would say 100 because they would think, well, if I only gain 1% per year, it would take 100 years for it to double to 100%. But we know that's not true because every year you've got to add on that percent you got from the previous years. And that's why we use the rule of 70s. Okay? Did you get it, Walker?
No.
You take 70 and you divide it by this in your calculator.
Yeah, I got 0.018.
You took 70 divided by 1.3.
Wait, what? I said
70 divided by
whenever I said
1.3.
70 divided. I got it right the first time. At least,
What'd you get the first time?
Roughly 58 years.
Is that what y'all got? Okay.
I got 53.85.
50 how much?
53.85.
We got to work on your calculator. 53.85
Yes.
years. Okay. So it'll take us about 54 years at this present growth for that population to double. Interesting.